Good morning and welcome back to another edition of Morning Java, brought to you by our friends at the Get-Go Marketing Cafe. Alex, much like the Pirates, Get-Go's always making moves. They've got new stuff coming in and keeping it fresh, keeping it exciting. How was that? I always like to try to get playful when we talk about Get-Go.
That's a good one. That's a heck of a transition into our segment too.
But I will say about Get-Go, they're doing a little bit better than the Pirates right now. I mean,
I would hope
people can be optimistic about the Pirates, but Get-Go isn't in a rebuild. They're not slumping. They didn't finish in last. They're always at the top. A team that isn't at the top, though, Alex, is the Pittsburgh Pirates, who, to their credit, have kept us very busy this offseason compared to the last couple of years where not a lot of moves were made. I guess last season there was a new manager, a new general manager, and they traded Marte. But this offseason has been very busy. Another big trade. Jamison Tyone traded earlier this week. He becomes the latest of the Pittsburgh Pirates, the third major cornerstone of this franchise to be dealt away. He goes to the New York Yankees. We've written about this a lot. We talked about it on the podcast as well. We're going to approach it from a different angle here on Java. Alex, there are a lot of things that Jamison Tyone did for the Pirates organization. I mean, he was a good pitcher, but I think as good as he was on the mound, he was equally as valuable as a leader in the clubhouse. He was someone, when he spoke, players listened, and everyone had a lot of respect for him in that clubhouse. My question for you now, Alex, is who is the leader of the Pittsburgh Pirates right now, and do they even have one?
I mean, it's a really good question because, Tyone, like you said, was one of those guys that people listened to whenever he spoke. Joe Musgrove was one of those guys who, whenever he spoke, people listened. Josh Bell, in his circle, people respected it. They really don't have any veterans on this team besides Gregory Polanco, and Gregory Polanco is 99.99% chance that this is his last, year with the Pirates in whatever facet this is, either traded, released, let go at the end of the offseason. They really don't have any of that veteran leadership. Now they're talking about they're going to add to this group eventually. They would like to add a starting pitcher. They might, go the Derek Holland-esque route where it's like, okay, here's an older starter who can help out. But Ben Cherington said he would like to see that leadership come from within. And if that's the case, you look at guys like Brian Reynolds, Ke'Bryan Hayes, who really haven't been in this locker room for long. And I'm not saying Ke'Bryan Hayes, the rookie, is going to go into Bradenton in 3 weeks and be like, okay, I'm going to be the leader of this team. But you would hope that some point down the line that he can be that type of guy to lead by example, that people gravitate to.
I think this team has two leaders right now. One is Polanco, just doing stories in the offseason. If you talk to any young outfielder, because Polanco unfortunately has had to have so many rehab stints, he's someone that a lot of guys in the minor leagues have a relationship with, because while Polanco was in Altoona or Indy or even in the lower levels, when there's a big leaguer there, they're going to ask him what's going on. He's someone that's also helped out players in spring training, and he is a good guy, and he's a good teammate. So, and I think he has a lot of relationships with the Latin players in the organization. So that's one leader. And I think another leader that we're forgetting to acknowledge here is Jacob Stallings, and someone who, the pitching staff loses Tyone, who I think is a great leader for a young staff, but they still have that mentor in Stallings who can, after a bad outing, he'll put his arm around a guy and say, we're going to figure this out together. And they'll break down film together, and they'll put together a good game plan. And having him on a young roster is very valuable.
Yeah. I mean, it's not only just, helping with the game plan, helping in game, knowing what's going on. It's like you said, that stuff in between starts, teaching, being that guy to listen to, being that guy that they can lean on. They need someone like him right now. And that's kind of why, whenever the Pirates have been doing these moves, you see, some people list like who else could go, and Stallings has always been on the list. They haven't heard any indication that, he's been actively shopped or anything, but, that's the type of guy that you do want to hang on to right now, especially with all this young pitching that they've acquired.
In 2016, this team was going through an interesting phase. The general manager deemed it a bridge year. He officially called it that, correct?
Yeah.
So after 3 straight trips to the playoffs, the bridge year happens where this young wave of talent comes up. This is where we first see Tyone. This is where we first see Chad Kuhl. This is where we first see Josh Bell, even though it was in a small sample, and a couple of other guys as well. Frazier made an appearance. Alex, looking back on this now, as we're in 2021, and Tyone talked about this in his press conference, should the bridge year have been the start of a rebuild? And did the Pirates miss the mark in that instance?
I'm not going to demonize for 2016 because that team was coming off of 98 wins. And if you would have rebuilt, at that point, yeah, you could have gotten an absolute king's ransom for Kutch, for Cole, for everyone. But you also would have, completely alienated the fan base of, well, we just won 98 games, now get out.
Yep.
How horrible that would have been, for relations. Not saying that, it wasn't, it would have been pulling off the duct tape instead of slowly taking it off right there. I don't blame for that. If the main problem with 2016, the reason why that team wasn't good was because Kutch fell off, Cole fell off, Liriano fell off. Let's be real. That's the reason why. The second biggest reason was because they didn't invest heavily enough in that team, and where they did invest was wrong. Giving John Neese $10 million, whatever J.A. Happ signed for 13. Hindsight 2020, horrible decision.
Bringing in John Jaso to play first base and bat leadoff.
See, I don't even mind the John Jaso aspect because you knew Josh Bell was going to be ready mid-season. I don't know. This is something Jameson talked about in his Zoom call, introduction with the Yankees, how back in 2016, he was talking to those guys, the Josh Bells, the Austin Meadows, the Tyler Glasnows, whenever they were in the minor leagues, like, hey, we're going to run this team at some point. And they were never really given that chance until like late 2019 or 2019 in general, because 2018, that's whenever they did trade Kutch, they did trade Cole. So they basically had one chance, really, and it didn't work.
And that you brought up 2018. I think that is when the rebuild really should have started.
Oh, it absolutely should.
Because 2016, you're right. They had no reason to think that Andrew McCutchen was going to just fall flat on his face in 2016 and just really never be the player that he was in those 3, 4, 5 seasons prior. They had no reason to believe that Garrett Cole was going to have the inconsistency that he did. And I mean, everything that the Pirates had done in the past 3, 4 years prior had gone their way. And so they were confident in saying, well, we can find any pitcher who struggled and make him good, because it worked for Liriano, it worked for Volquez, it worked for Burnett, it worked, the list goes on at J. Happ. And then it stopped working with Jonathan Sanchez, and it stopped working with John Neese. And 2016 went wrong. And then I had no problem when 2017, when they said, all right, we're going to give this one more run. We still have Cole. McCutchen can recover, and he did have a decent year in 2017. But the problem there, Marte gets popped for steroids, and that's a very important piece of the lineup gone. But even in those years, they were still in the mix around the trade deadline, and really nothing happened. After 2017 is when this rebuild really should have started. And they were scared to do it because they didn't want the stigma to be, oh, they're being cheap, or, oh, they're giving up. When in reality, that was the best move for the organization to make. And they did make the moves, like trading Garrett Cole and not getting young, sustainable talent for the future, for my money, is one of the worst moves ever made in the history of the organization. I mean, he was incredibly valuable. I know that his value isn't what it is now, but still, I mean, you got 4 replacement level players for one of the best pitchers in the world. That was a horrible move. The McCutchen trade was okay, but if they had went the other route and gotten, 4 or 5 young guys for both of McCutchen and Cole, and then dealt Marte on top of that, you have a great farm system, and you still have Tyler Glasnow, and you still have Austin Meadows, and you still have young guys like Bell and Tyone and all these other players that you can really piece together something. And I think that, we're in a different spot in 2021 if the Pirates make those moves then, as opposed to waiting this just now. But the reality is that was never going to happen with the general manager that they had and with the manager that they had. They were just kind of saying, we're going to try to win with what we got, and if not, fire us. And we know what happened.
The GM, not to, kick the corpse a little bit right there of his time as GM, but he had just signed an extension. The ownership had given him all the faith in the world.
4 years.
You're our guy going forward. If any time to start a long-term rebuild, it is right that second. Yeah.
So, Alex, one of our best Javas that we did together, I think, is when we talked about the rule changes and the extended playoff format and the DH coming to the National League. You and I, we have some good battles there. It was announced by Major League Baseball this week that they're basically going back to the way things were before the pandemic. There's not going to be an extended playoff format, and there's not going to be a designated hitter in the National League. I will now give you the floor to rub it in my face.
Oh, really? We get
Yeah.
to acknowledge that I am right.
I mean, I knew that just because you're right, like what happened doesn't mean it's the right thing for the game of baseball. I'll stand by that.
But I am right. That's what's
Go ahead.
important.
Just
But yeah,
talk.
Major League Baseball offered the union a trade of universal designated hitter for the expanded playoffs for 2021, and it was a no deal. And honestly, it's not that surprising that it was a new deal because those are going to be two key points for this new CBA. And you know what? It's going to be very ugly negotiations, and I don't see the union wanting to give up a single bargaining chip ahead of that. And the expanded playoffs is something that owners really, really want because you just saw how much interest was drawn into baseball for those couple days, how many extra eyeballs were in those first couple rounds of the playoffs, even if it was just a couple days. Maybe 16 is a little bit ridiculous. I'll stand by that. I think expanded playoffs to like 12 teams whenever they have this 2-team expansion would be the best thing to do. You know, rip off like the old NFL model where the top 2 seeds don't have to deal with the wild card round or whatever they want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. The universal DH is kind of a tricky thing of it because the league wants it, the players want it, so it's not happening in the National League. And that's just kind of ridiculous that's a trade. That's becoming a trade chip whenever both sides want it.
Yeah, and I don't get why.
I don't like it, but they want it.
I don't get why it's being prolonged. I think most of the fans want it. I think, like you said, the players, the teams, I don't really see why they're putting it off. It's just baseball being baseball, saying, well, this is the way it's always been, so we're going to keep doing it that way. And I don't get that. As far as an extended playoff format, and I agree, 16 might be a bit much. I'm never going to complain about more playoff baseball, though. And like you talked about, those first 4 days where there were games from noon, like start time at noon, ending at around, the final game would end around like 1 a.m. That was awesome. And baseball needs that. I mean, there's no other sport. Like playoff football has one weekend, the first weekend that they just did, the divisional round or wild card weekend, where there's like 3 games on Saturday and Sunday, and then there's bowl games all day, but those have really lost their importance. Baseball offered something a couple months ago that really no other sport can offer aside from March Madness, and which is just important game after important game, and there's overlap, and you can flip between, or if you have 2 TVs, you can be watching both, and you can't get that in the NFL. I mean, you get it on Sundays during the regular season, but you can't really get that in the playoffs because the games are too big ratings-wise to really overlap, where baseball, you can do that, and that's good, and they need to get back to that because I think that's how you grow the game. As much effort's being put into speeding things up and, you know, maybe juicing the baseballs or whatever, and the three outcome at bats that, you know, they're so, you know, polarizing now. Put all that aside. Give us more playoff baseball. Give us something exciting to watch, and don't put it up against, you know, Thursday night football or during an election year, during a debate, you know, things like that. Give us tons of playoff baseball to watch when there's nothing else on. That's how you reel in new fans.